Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 Conference on Religion, Ethics, and Science, or CORES. I'm Barry Ritchie, and on behalf of Arizona State University, I want to offer a very warm welcome to our guests from all over the world. The conversation you've tuned into is entitled Toward a Humane Economy. In a few moments, we will start our conversation, but first let me remind you how we are operating today. I will first introduce our distinguished panel members, after which they will engage the topic for 60 minutes or so. Following that initial portion of the conversation, we will engage questions submitted by you, our audience, through the question and answer function in Zoom. I apologize in advance that we likely will not be able to work through all the questions submitted in the time allowed, but I am sure you'll find all the questions interesting. As usual in such events, the opinions expressed by our speakers are not necessarily those of the sponsors or Arizona State University. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists for this discussion. Mary Hirschfeld completed a PhD in economics at Harvard University under the direction of Lawrence Summers and Jeffrey Williamson. As well, she also earned a PhD in moral theology from the University of Notre Dame under the direction of Jean Porter. Dr. Hirschfeld's research explores the boundary between economics and theology. That work has culminated in her recent book, Aquinas and the Market, Toward a Humane Economy, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. Russ Roberts is the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and President Designate at Shalem College in Israel. Educated at the University of Chicago, Dr. Roberts has taught at George Mason University and Washington University in St. Louis, among others. His popular podcast, Econ Talk, has been running now for 15 years. His book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness, was published in 2014. Vernon Smith was awarded the 2002 Memorial Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work in experimental economics. He holds dual appointments at Chapman University in the School of Business and Economics and in the School of Law. He's also on the leadership team of the Economic Science Institute. Pertinent to the themes of this conference, his book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, Reflections on Faith, Science, and Economics, was published by the Acton Institute in 2017. Our session will be led by Russ Emmett, Director of ASU's Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. Dr. Emmett received his PhD from the University of Manitoba and earned an IMBA from the University of South Carolina. He entered the study of economics in order to explore the relationship of Christianity and economics, a constant theme throughout his work. Now that we've met our panelists, Ross, let's begin our conversation.
Thank you very much, Barry. I appreciate the opportunity to bring together three people whose work I greatly admire in all kinds of different ways, and some of whom I've known a long time and some of whom I have not yet even met. And so we're going to, in this session, discuss several questions and that we've circulated among ourselves so that they have some ideas of these. We may not go quite as long as Barry suggested in that mode. So if you want to start posing questions at some point after about a half an hour or so, we'd be probably turning to answering questions if they appear. And I do have a bank of questions that I can ask to keep us moving forward. Thank you all for joining us, and I welcome the opportunity to converse with you. The first question I wanted to ask to start us off is, how does your religious tradition present the ideas of wealth and trade, markets, And is there a passage in your tradition's holy texts that you think of as you think about trade and the orientation towards wealth? What does that passage capture for you? Who would like to? I don't need to be the dictator who decides who speaks first. So whoever wishes to speak first can do so.
Ross.
Yes.
I'll begin, and I want to thank you for inviting me to this event. And I'd like to begin. The text I gave you was of the parable of the talents, which I think almost anyone who's interested in trade and markets immediately thinks of. But I want to begin with a broader text in my discussion, and it's in Hebrews 11:1. And in Hebrews, I love Hebrews because it's this grand sweep. It tells the Judeo-Christian story from Genesis to Jesus, and it's a great grand biblical sweep of our faith. But in 11:1 in Hebrews, it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." I see that as governing not only a great definition of faith for religion, but also science. Because all science, what is the thing we most hope for in science? It is that our theories will be predictive, okay? And also, it always involves evidence that's not seen. And the concept, for example, of gravity that begins with Newton has that characteristic. Okay, well, now how does this relate to economics? Well, very simply, Adam Smith wrote 2 scientific treatises. He wrote first the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then the Wealth of Nations. And these, more than anything, I see as involving the scientific treatment first of human sociability, its origin and propositions governing sort of human sociability, and then his great work in economics, which is, of course, better and more broadly known than the Theory of Moral Sentiments. But in a sense, you see Adam Smith, before he launched into his economics treatise, needed to ask the more fundamental question, and that has to do with the origins of human sociability, because economics just simply is an expression, really, of human sociability. So with that, that's sort of the way I would react to your question, Ross.
Thank you very much. Who would like to follow?
I'll go next. I want to echo Vernon's gratitude for being invited to be on this panel, and it's incredibly fun to be on with my friends Vernon and Mary, who I've known for a while. Russ, you and I also go back, but not quite in the same way. In Judaism, the treatment of trade, money, what I would call the mundane, the material, and the physical is nuanced. So one of the things I love about Judaism, we're to enjoy the mundane and the physical, but at the same time we try to elevate them. So we're enjoined to work for 6 days, but to rest on the 7th, the Jewish Sabbath or Shabbat. There's nothing wrong with making money, but we also have to keep in mind the perspective and to step back from that 1 day a week. We have to give at least 10% of our income to the poor. We try to remember what the Talmud says when it asks, who is rich? And the answer is the person who is content with what they have. So ambition is human. We can't, we're built with what the economist would say, more is better than less, but we don't want to become too focused on that. That's a description that is positive, meaning it's how the world works often, but it's not necessarily how we want it to work. And we should keep money in perspective. And the line I want to share from scripture is from the book of Exodus, chapter 22, which happens to be the section of the Torah that will be read in synagogue tomorrow if you're not locked down, which is this amazing quote. It says, and I'm reading it in translation, rough translation, not the literal Hebrew. It says, if you take your neighbor's garment as collateral for a loan, you have to return it before sunset, presumably every night, meaning the only thing that's encouraging this poor person from returning the loan that you've made to them is this piece of collateral, which they desperately want. They're so poor that the only thing they have for collateral is their night garment, either their blanket or their pajamas, essentially. And it says you have to return it, quote, for that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. How shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass when he cries unto me that I will hear, for I am gracious. The idea being that you have to have empathy for people who have less than you. And although it is naturally in your self-interest to keep that collateral as a way to encourage the repayment of the loan, a person's your brother, and you have to return it at night when a person wants to go to sleep. So to me, that's it's a nice summary of the Jewish perspective on money. It's okay to make money. It's okay to succeed in the world, but you have to keep it in perspective.
Russ just sort of spoke right to the point I was going to make. There's many passages of scripture I love more than the one I'm going to cite because there's more to scripture than just what it says about economics. But I'll go ahead and cite the one that I used to lead off my book. You cannot serve both God and mammon, from the Beatitudes. And as Russ just said, the scripture as a whole, and even the New Testament, which is more skeptical of our abuses of wealth than the Old Testament, has nothing against at all people working hard, making a good living for themselves. Ordinary human flourishing is a good thing. But the really strong teaching in scripture is to avoid making money, mammon, success, ambition, wealth an idol that displaces God. Wealth is a wonderful servant. It's a terrible master. And we all fall into that trap. So that's where I go.
Thank you all. I will chime in my 2 cents worth on this one as well, just to get 4 passages of scripture out there. When I was first becoming interested in economics, coming out of a context of biblical studies and having other interests, I was really captured by Lionel Robbins' definition of economics, which is essentially focused upon scarcity. It's a definition that dominated the economics discipline for much of the 20th century, although it's begun perhaps as a good thing, given the comments of the panel that have pointed to other things. It's begun to kind of slide into the background a bit, but the definition is that it's the examination of people making choices in the context of limited means and unlimited wants, and the necessity there for needing some mechanism for coordination. And of course, the biblical text that has been used many times to sort of heighten that is the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis. And there, the fall, human beings, the Christian conception of the fall, human beings being banished from paradise, and the condemnation is that they will die. They will live with limited means. They will have to work in order to obtain what they want. They probably will want many more things than they can possess. And of course, it's not stated in the biblical text, but the economist then takes that, well, to be able to get more things, you're going to need to coordinate your activities through markets. I recently have been thinking that this is kind of a too narrow version of the use of the passage, because one of the things about that passage is that it also means that human beings become dependent upon other people. In other words, in order to get things done, I have to persuade you to join me. I have to show that it's in your interest to cooperate with me, even though what I'm trying to do is to get you to cooperate for my interest. But of course, if I'm going to get you to cooperate for my interest, then I'm going to have to show you that it's in your interest to cooperate with me. And Russ has spoken eloquently about this many times on his show and in some of his books. But this idea goes back even before Adam Smith, probably the first person to articulate this kind of mutuality of it's not so much aligning interests. It's not that we have to have the same interests. We have to bring each other's interests into conversation with each other so that we can satisfy both of them. Was Bois Guilbert, the French writer, about less than 100 years before Smith. And he called this reciprocal utility, that we have to reciprocate things that help each other gain what we need. And I think that Russ's reading of Smith on this comes very close to that kind of notion of mutual dependence in order to be able to survive in a world where we have limited means at our immediate disposal, and yet have many possible uses for them. I just ask, any of you want to respond to things other people said before we move on to another question? I don't want to make this mechanical, so if people would like to say something back and forth, I'd be happy to hear it.
I wanted to comment on your comment, Ross, which is, I think it's in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet in Hebrew. There's nothing new under the sun. Adam Smith famously writes in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations about the marvel that is a woolen coat, the myriad of people that have to work together to create it. And of course, there's a modern version of that from Leonard Read called iPencil, that a simple product like a pencil is quite complicated. Turns out this expression of the marvel of human cooperation that you referenced is in the Talmud about 2,000 years ago. I pulled up this quote because I thought we might have a chance to talk about it. A Talmudic sage, Ben Zoma, was standing on the stairs of the Temple Mount, and he saw a huge crowd, and he said a blessing to God that ended with gratitude for creating all these people to serve me. And people would say, why would you say such a blessing like that? And he explained it this way. He said, how much effort did Adam, the first man, exert before he found bread to eat? He plowed, sowed, reaped, sheaved, threshed, winnowed in the wind, separated the grain from the chaff, ground the grain into flour, sifted, kneaded, and baked. And only thereafter he ate. And I, on the other hand, wake up and find all these prepared for me. Human society employs a division of labor, and each individual benefits from the service of the entire world. Similarly, how much effort did Adam, the first man, exert before he found a garment to wear? He sheared, laundered, combed, spun and wove, and only thereafter he found a garment. And I, on the other hand, wake up and find all of these prepared for me. Members of all nations, merchants and craftsmen diligently come to the entrance of my home, and I wake up and find all of these before me. So an appreciation for how the web of human cooperation, which is sustained by markets, by Adam Smith's human propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, creates the fact that when I want a loaf of bread, if I want, I can just go buy it, and it's always waiting for me, as long as we let prices adjust and allow some level of economic freedom and choice.
Thanks, Russ.
Ross,
Yeah.
I see the fall as the result of human curiosity. You see, human curiosity trumped the you see God's directive that we follow his wishes. And in doing that, you see, we have opened ourselves up to all of the pain and difficulties that we experience in human affairs and in economic affairs. And that, you see, that knowledge, that seeking after knowledge has become sort of the driver of human social and economic affairs. I wanted though to ask Russ. Jesus spoke not only about the material poor, but he also the poor in spirit. And I'd be interested in what you would have to say about the Judeo tradition with regard to being poor in spirit.
It's a great question. And I think about it a lot lately. I think we've spent, I'm now talking about modern economists, we've spent way too much time on inequality and not enough on poverty. They're not the same thing. We're spending way too much time on material poverty and not enough on human flourishing and dignity. I think the quote I gave you from the book of Exodus, it relates to that. The idea that the poor person, we don't just want that person to have the blanket because it's cold outside. We want them to have the dignity of having the blanket and being taken care of. There's a lot of course, focus in Judaism on how you give charity. Maimonides, the great medieval sage, said the highest level of charity is to give somebody a job so that they don't have to rely on charity. But he also talks a lot about the importance of anonymity, anonymous giving, anonymous receiving. And I do think that this modern focus on what we can measure, in particular income, has led us greatly astray on where the sources of human meaning and satisfaction come from. And there are probably other Jewish sources I'm missing that I'm just not thinking of on one foot. But maybe I'll come back to that. It's a great question. I just think it's an incredibly important thing. This failure to understand where real satisfaction comes from, and the relentless modern focus on income. Of course, we don't want people to go hungry, but income is not all we care about. We also care about meaning and satisfaction, pride, autonomy, a sense of dignity. And I think we've really missed out on that as modern policy commenters.
That allows me to ask a question that takes us forward into the second question I was going to ask, and I won't even do the prelude to it, but just sort of ask the question. So it seems that some of our discussion has led us to ask, how do we deal with questions beyond the sort of directly economic realm, to how economics interacts with conceptions of virtue or the ends that we should pursue in life, etc. I wonder if anyone would like to comment that, and I guess I'll ask Mary, since I know she probably does want to comment on it, to start us off.
Yeah, although if I might, I had wanted to follow up on Russ's interesting remarks. Yeah.
Feel free.
So one of the scriptural passages that I love dearly is from Psalms. It's be still and know that I am God. And it seems to me that one of the dangers that wealth presents for us is this idea that I have control over things. I can achieve whatever I want. I have power through my wealth. And that's the opposite of spiritual poverty, which is an idea that we are dependent ultimately, obviously, on God, but as we've already eloquently elaborated, on each other deeply. So it's just, And our lack of spiritual poverty, which I think we get from our wealth and our affluence, I think makes it harder for us to deal justly and humanely with others. Okay, so to your question about the thinking about virtue as a telos, in the original question that you posed, you said economists like to think of themselves as agnostic about the ends of human activity.
Yeah.
And so we just say, you know, if we maximize wealth, then people can pursue their own ends and we're not going to judge between them, something like that. One of the key points of my book or my work is to say that that itself is actually not being agnostic about ends. There are strong claims. If your idea is we're going to let people maximize their utility however they see fit, you're making a claim that the approach to happiness is by maximizing, by trying to pursue more of something. It's got an idea of quantitative extension that's smuggled in there. And that's actually a strong claim. It's not neutral at all. So it seems to me that the business of being a human is thinking about the goods of life and thinking well about them and trying to discern what is really good to want. The whole business of virtue formation is learning how to discern between good choices and bad choices. And part of that discernment, I think, has to take into account the fact that we're finite and respecting our finitude. So, and if you have that idea, then if I discern the order of goods, I should quickly realize that the human goods of relationship, of respect for other people, of the way I interact with people are higher than how big my jacuzzi is, right? So in the discernment of goods, you would see that economic wealth is a servant of these higher goods. You would think about it as order to that. And in thinking that way, I think you would start to see that it's best to think about wealth in terms of how much do I need in order to accomplish what I want to accomplish? And then it would allow you to decide how much is enough. And there would be this idea of satiety as being a possible outcome of our life. I could reach a point in my economic life where I have sufficient income to pursue the higher goods that are important to me. And then I have enough. And that's missing from the economic way of thinking.
Ross, I wanted to mention the pandemic.
Vernon, I'm just going to ask you to slide closer to the camera so we can hear you a little
Yes.
better.
Yes, I want to bring up the pandemic and our response to it. See, social distancing is almost a contradiction of terms. I mean, the essence of being social is to narrow the distance between people. And you see that particularly in both the writings of Hume and Smith. Now, for me, it's very easy. The pandemic, I love it because I've never been more productive. I've had a minimum of interruptions, and you know I've loved it. And when I go out, I not only wear a mask, I wear a double mask. So I'm at my age, I have to be very careful. But the pandemic is a great challenge to just a lot of people whose livelihood and sense of social betterment involves being out there and interacting with others on a daily and regular basis. And so in that sense, I think it's a bigger challenge to a lot of people than it is to me. And somehow making it through this time. And you know, if you go back to the early part of the century and the Spanish flu, turns out, you know, we had riots in all of North American cities, all of them. There was a lot of the same sorts of social and cultural issues and problems that arose at that time, and I think that's important, that when we have our social lives interrupted, we are indeed very much challenged.
Russ, can I
Go ahead.
Can I respond to both those comments? I so agree with Vernon. I think a lot of the response to the pandemic has been crafted by people who don't bear any of those costs of lockdown, and I think it's been an incredible human tragedy that of course we should focus on death, but that's the thing we count. We don't count lost meaning that people have because they can't take care of their families anymore, because we've shut down their business, and they've killed their dream. And I just think that's a really important point. But I wanted to respond to Mary's comment, which I think is quite important about the state of economics. I love that quote, Mary, the "be still" from Tehillim, from Psalms. There's a story of a great rabbi, the Chavetz Chaim, who lived in the 1930s, and he saw a man racing on the street, frantically running ahead, and he stopped him and he said, "What are you chasing?" And the man said, "My livelihood." And the Chavetz Chaim said, "Well, how do you know it's not behind you? And if you'd sit still, it would catch up with you." This franticness, this need for motion, for taking action to maximize, I think is a mistake in and of itself. It's not something that's valuable in and of itself. And I think economics had a chance to take a different turn, ironically, with Gary Becker, who you could argue was the economist's economist, the person who tried to squeeze everything into maximization. And I once heard Gary answer the question, what economists were most influential on you? And he listed, to my total surprise, Adam Smith and Alfred Marshall. And the reason I think he listed Adam Smith was precisely because of what Vernon was talking about earlier, that Smith was uniting, in Gary's mind, the wealth of nations and the theory of moral sentiments, the two parts of our lives. And Gary writes a paper, Becker writes a paper in, I think, 1965, the allocation of time paper, where he basically says, we don't care about stuff. We care about what that stuff allows us to have that's more meaningful and rich. So the inputs into a meaningful and satisfying evening with a friend or your spouse you need to buy a bottle of wine, you need to have steak, you need to invest time into prepare the steak and the dinner and the uncork the wine. But the goal, the wine doesn't give us, quote, utility. It's the evening that gives us utility. And everyone, I think every economist would agree with that. Every economist, well, of course, but our models we forgot about, it was too hard, too complicated. So Becker, who was worried about approbation and opprobrium and all these things that Adam Smith was focused on in the theory of moral sentiments, they all got left out of economics in the modern world, and we're all in the modern mathematical framework. And all we do is worry about maximizing utility. And I think the last thing I'll say is that recently was reading Ariel Rubinstein's definition of rationality. He says, what is desirable? Look at what's desirable, look at what's feasible, and pick the most feasible thing that's the most desirable thing that's feasible. But he doesn't ask the question, which economists never do, what should be desirable to us? We are given a set of preferences by our nature, our surroundings, but the idea that we can transform ourselves. James Buchanan said, man needs liberty to become the man he wants to become. Yeah. This idea is totally out of modern economics. And it's a tragedy. We're teaching a generation of students that the goal of life is to get as much as you can for yourself. Oh, we'll put altruism in, of course, but it's just the wrong focus, and the tools deceive, I think, and can lead us astray if we're not careful.
Yeah. I just heard you quoting that line not recently in your conversation with Don Boudreau, and was
Correct.
Reminded how important that line from Jim is. We want to become the person we want to become, not just satisfy the wants that we have. And it makes eminent sense. I sense Mary wanting to kick in on this. Do you wish to do that, or?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do, because the pandemic provides an example of this kind of mistake. I mean, it seems like the impetus behind all the lockdown, all the social distancing, all of this stuff that's creating so much human loss is that we want to maximize lifespans. We want to prevent early deaths from people. And what's been lost in all this, and to me, it's all been about striking a balance, but what's been lost about this is as we've all curtailed our lives, maybe just a little bit like Vernon, maybe a lot like others of us, those curtailments are a loss of life right now. Like life is not just a matter of living as many years as possible. It's about living well. It's like it's engaging in the moment, which is thick with relationship and interaction and all these sorts of things. If we added that loss into our calculations, what we've done over the last year has been 1 million people in America have lost significant chunk of this year in the name of extending life. So it's, again, this emphasis on extending the means rather than thinking about the content of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience that is connected to this, and I'm going to paraphrase it in order to tie it to the conversation we just had. And the question is, okay, so ironically, can we put on our economist thinking cap and ask the question, well, how can we help, lead, whatever verb you want, to motivate people to consider needs that are higher order than simply material well-being. And there's also a sense in the question that's being asked, that the person wanting to know sort of how can we help people understand that it's in terms of material possessions, it's not just more material possessions, but how can we be happy with enough that to be able to support our other goals that we have been talking about.
Well, you know, as parents, it's a job I hope we can agree is not for the government to do, but for parents and educators to do. As you mentioned earlier, I'm becoming president soon of Shalem College in Jerusalem. And that's an old-fashioned idea at Shalem of what education is. And I think the answer is to the question is education, whether by parents or educators, is the way you find out what is a virtuous life, what is a life well lived. At Shalem, our students read the classic works of Western and Jewish thought. You know, Aristotle had something to say about this. Scripture had something to say about these questions of becoming the person you want to become and what is most rewarding. And Adam Smith has something to say about it in the theory of moral sentiments. There's emphasis on being respected and loved by those around you is where ultimate happiness and meaning comes from. So, you know, the simple answer to that question is read widely, read thoughtfully, find a mentor, find a teacher, find someone to share these ideas with and learn about them, because they're all there. You just have to be exposed to them and explore them. So I think it's a journey of a lifetime, by the way. It's not a pill you take or a class you take. It's called growing up, and takes a while. But that's, I think, what much of life should be about.
Oh, you know,
Go ahead, Vern.
I think it's
Vern, can you
interesting
slide
that-
forward again? Can
I
you
beg your
slide
pardon,
forward a little?
yes.
We're just
I
having a
think
little
it's
trouble here.
interesting that when you go to chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith doesn't talk about utility. Utility, I think, was seen as something hidden. And so he begins with something much more visible and operational. You see, he talks about buyers coming to market and bringing with them a willingness to pay, a willingness to sacrifice other good money, which represents other goods, to get any particular item. And he models price discovery in terms of the interaction of buyers who come to market with this willingness to pay, but they also want to buy cheap, you see. And sellers are in there with a willingness to accept these reservation prices, and they want to sell dear. And what you get in chapter 7 that I do not find in any of the modern treatments, utility maximizing treatments, is the notion that prices come out of the interaction of people, buyers and sellers in markets. The modern theory, where do prices come from? They come from supply and demand, and is treated in a very mechanical way, whereas Smith links it up with people, real people, buyers and sellers interacting. And, you know, I have recently in revisiting that, have kind of discovered anew and developed an appreciation for Adam Smith in this very insightful treatment of markets as a decentralized information discovery process. And really a lot of the modern concepts, I think, if you read carefully in chapter 7, you can see that that's really what Adam Smith is talking about, although he didn't have our modern language, you see, to express it. But the ideas are there.
So to take up the question of how to raise up families and students and people, and just basically build a culture where people seek the things that are really of value, rather than having a mistaken idea that more money is better. Everything Russ said, I just endorse wholeheartedly. But when I'm teaching my students, I also find it effective to point out how completely futile the modern approach to happiness is, how much anxiety and frustration there is. If you're built into the idea that more is better, you move into your 2,000 square foot house and it's great for about 6 months until you find out that you need to have more space for all this other stuff. There's just never quite enough. Or the phenomenon where you get your 5% or 10% raise and it's awesome until you feel really strapped for cash the next year. We're the richest people who have ever lived, and we all feel really, not quite having enough. So this anxiety and sense of depletion just points to the fallacy of trying to pursue happiness this way. And everybody that Russ talked about, and Thomas Aquinas is good on this too, will point out that trying to pursue happiness through extension of wealth is really counterproductive. And helping students to see that is very helpful.
I will just toss in as a comment. Yeah, Russ is clapping. I'll toss in as a comment a note from Rabbi Dean from Bet Emmanuel and Tempe, and that is better bad wine with good friends than good wine with bad friends, and that captures some of what we're talking about. We hope we can also get some decent wine with some decent friends, so one of the questions from the audience, again, continuing sort of pushing forward. I have a couple now, so I'm adding those in here. Given that one of the consequences of the fall is that we have to work to meet our mundane needs, the market's a cooperative enterprise to coordinate efforts to meet human needs. But democratic self-governance is also a cooperative endeavor to meet human needs. So what are your thoughts about the morality of markets versus the morality of government with regards to meeting human needs? Is there really a distinction between the two? Any comments?
Well, I'm happy to. Mary, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
I think that was a it was a tie. You go first.
Yeah, so this is a chance to be way more positive about economics from a theological point of view. The beauty of me going out into the marketplace and, say, running a dry cleaner store is that I'm serving my neighbor with concrete goods, but it also allows me to employ my own agency in figuring out my own, developing my own talents. I hire a few people, I develop a community there, I help them do that. I have relationships with my suppliers, with my customers. And that agency is part of how I live out my human nature. We're created in the image and likeness of God, who is a creator. And in our work and in our enterprise, we're co-creators with God in service of the community in all the ways that were said. The problem with markets is not any of that. It's the idolatry that comes with it, this idea that money is the good that we should serve. That said, there are places, there's some things that we can only do cooperatively through government because it requires some kind of top-down control. But I just want you to notice that when I go to the ballot box and vote, that's not nearly as engaging me in acting out my vocation as a Christian as is me trying to live well and virtuously in my productive life. So I have the instinct that the Catholic tradition would call subsidiarity, which is put the agency as close to the individual as possible. It's not always possible. But yeah, and so yeah, that's all I want to say about that. So.
Well, that was very well said. And I think the technical way I think about it is not as inspiring as Mary's, is that sometimes the feedback loops that reinforce good behavior in market transactions are missing in political transactions. But there are some things that markets don't do well, and government should do those things. Often we get mistaken. I think those of us who think the way I do is being anarchists somehow or against government being involved. The important thing is the government should do what it does well, and the private sector voluntary action should do what it does well. And I think the danger is the idolization of government as a super parent who can solve all our problems the way our parents did when we were little. And an example of this would be the issue we were talking about earlier about flourishing. There are a lot of people, a lot of economists want government to get in the happiness business, to do the policies that create happiness. I think that's a grotesque misunderstanding of what government's capable of doing and what the real sources of meaning in life come from. Those have to come from the bottom up. They have to come from our choices. And I think it's kind of ironic that we're talking about the idolization of wealth. As economists, Mary, we're not supposed to say that. It's up to you, whatever floats your boat, whatever gives you utility. The idea that I would suggest to people that the pursuit of the material is a false fool's game, which Adam Smith does really beautifully in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. That's sort of a modern economist taboo to suggest where happiness might come from. We're supposed to be agnostic about that, as Ross was, I think, suggesting earlier. But in terms of government and cooperation, I think it's important not to romanticize what we do collectively through government. I think we under-romanticize economic cooperation through the market, and we over-romanticize government. Why that is an interesting question, but I think that's a challenge we ought to work to work against. We ought to work against.
I think that the thing that the popular conception of markets that's wrong is the idea that it involves taking. People don't get the point. That is that you have to give in order to receive. You see, to me, that's the first principle of a market. It's inherent in the whole notion of gains from trade. You see, it's mutual simultaneous giving as well as benefiting and taking. And I think if you approach markets from that perspective, I think it gives you a much better vision, you see, of why it's important for us all to embrace markets, but also in a moral way, you see, so that fortunately the rule of law, thou shalt not steal, doesn't really require much enforcement in modern democratic societies. There's a huge amount of volunteer enforcement as part of the culture.
And so I'm continuing with the audience questions, but there's one that there's sort of two that I think that tie together well and turn around some of the discussion that we've been having. There's within Christian circles, there's a prosperity gospel kind of argument that if you live a committed Christian life, that it brings greater prosperity over time. This in some ways contradicts the kind of argument that's been developed here, and yet it seems to tie into part of our culture that greed is good. So we should pursue whatever we want, and greed is good. And within the Christian tradition, there are those who are advocating that you should receive prosperity in this life, and they don't define prosperity as broadly as we might have been describing it here. And I wondered if you have any thoughts on that. Well, I won't take it in a dark direction. I'll leave it at that and see if you have any comments.
Vernon, you should answer that question at least to start with. And if you don't want to, I'm happy to channel what I've learned from you about it, but go ahead if you want.
Well, I think that it's very important for our material welfare that we engage in markets, but also very much part of our spiritual welfare, because we have this, it gives us this feeling, you see, that that we not only benefit, but we bring benefits to others. And I think this is, as I indicated before, this is sort of missed in a lot of the popular conceptions of markets, but they're very much at the heart of not only markets, but our social life. You know, see, interesting, you see, if the theory of moral sentiments, you see, is not about people being other regarding because they're not self-interested. No, in the theory of moral sentiments, we're all strictly self-interested, and indeed, and the model, you see, has to do with starting around age 4.5 or 5. We have to engage with playfellows, and they're not as indulgent as our parents when we show our anger, and so we start to be disciplined by the need to follow rules, and these rules require us to be respectful of our neighbors. And indeed, the propositions in Adam Smith on beneficence and justice, you see, they directly deal with this phenomenon, and we have to, you see, if we don't automatically assume, see, a common knowledge of the self-interest, we don't know what's a benefit. We can't even know what a benefit or a hurt is. So that it's sort of central to the whole model is that we're all strictly self-interested, and we have common knowledge that we're all self-interested. But then we learn to, you see, to you know, as Smith says, we cannot look our neighbor or mankind in the face and avow that all our decisions, all of our actions are based upon our self-interest. So he distinguishes between between being self-interested and action in the self-interest. And that's a really important idea, you see, for understanding, I think, what Adam Smith is all about.
I'm going to, in the interest of getting another question in, bring us to a last question, which is a little on the darker side, but it's a good way to end. Since economists usually start off darkly, we've started off so supportively of community and the like. One of the questions is how our understanding of death ties into the sense of the humane economy. And I might just add not only individual physical death, but also deaths of communities and the loss of that sociability that we've been talking about. And I just wonder if any of you want to pick up on that. Just death.
Yeah. I definitely want to respond to that. I increasingly think that our refusal to admit that we die is important to understand for a lot of the ills in our society. Blaise Pascal has a great section in his Pensées on this about our proclivity for looking for diversion. So when we look into the abyss that is death, which is really unthinkable, the idea that I could suddenly not be here really is, you know, a dramatic thought. And then it raises questions about, well, what happens with death? And it's a mystery and we don't know. And so one very human reaction is to just frantically divert ourselves, divert our attention away from this. And he talks about, I become consumed with card playing or whatever, and it always has a sense of franticness because it's running away from rather than towards the meaning of life. If I have decided that I do not want to think about death, which means I also probably don't want to think about God, whether there is a God, how that works, or any of that stuff, then I have to think about finding my happiness in a material finite world. And I'm going to naturally think about wanting these desires for the infinite to be pursued in a finite way. And that again leads to that frantic chasing after. So trying to find a moment where we look our death straight in the face and think, what do I want this finite life to look like is probably a good place to start.
I just this week got my first dose of the Moderna vaccine. I'm 66 years old, and my joke is now I can go back to, once I got the second dose, I can pretend to going back to the idea that I'm going to live forever. What the pandemic has done for me, I think for a lot of people, is remind us that life is finite. Death hovers over us. But once I get the vaccine, then I won't think about it anymore. It'll be great. But we are finite. Judaism has always emphasized this world. There is a world to come in Judaism, but there's a strong emphasis on this world. God says in the book of Deuteronomy, I put before you today a choice between life and death. Choose life. And I wrote about that in passing in my book, The Choice, that, what does that mean? Who would choose death? What kind of that's bizarre. Of course, the Egyptians were really into death, which is part of the reason the Exodus was so important. It was a death worshiping culture. And, the Bible, Hebrew scriptures is really a voice and a vote to remember that this world is precious. And I always think of choose life as the Hebrews of B'charta Chaim. Choose life, meaning it's finite. Enjoy it, experience it, its richness, its texture. Don't distract yourselves the way Pascal said with card games. He meant Twitter, I think, but he said card games or whatever. For me these days, chess.com. I'm playing too many chess games as a form of diversion. There's a compulsiveness to that we have to be, I think that's helpful to be aware of. So choosing life in the face of death, which we are all mortal, it seems like really, really good advice.
Russ, I just got the vaccine also. And
live it up.
This rapid, the Moderna, yes, this rapid development of vaccine, there's 3 or 4 at least very close that are going to be that's going to be available here before the year is out, and then probably another dozen or so you see in development. Also, the treatments have been enormously advanced as soon as people began to get a sense of how this disease works. All of that knowledge is just off the shelf of the biotech industry. It's amazing. Why has that been so fast? It's been because of markets and the miracle of markets, you see, that have drawn resources into biopharmacy, biotech. And it's interesting how that industry has really boomed during this pandemic, because investors are realizing what a pot of gold you see there is in the industry, and of what the government done. What the government has done is to buy the stuff off the shelf. That's what's done, but the benefits are really coming from markets.
One of the questions I'm tempted to go two different directions, so I will go one of them instead of standing there hemming and hawing like Vernon's asked. The notion of subsidiarity, which has been brought up, and one of the questions from the audience asks, the current dynamic, even the comments that Vern was just making about the biochemical industry, the tendency in our society is towards conglomeration, to ever bigger. Amazon can do so many things well that it now can do almost everything well, at least in terms of delivery. And the question is, what about rural communities and the agency that's removed from them, with more or less all the local businesses facing competition that more or less drives them out of business, and leaves the community stripped of some of the things that tie that community together, as opposed to things that provide them with a local connection. Just wonder your thoughts on that, both as economists and as people interested in these interconnections.
I think I'm most interested in hearing what Russ has to say about this, because he's interacted with a lot of people who think about big business. But real briefly for myself, as a theologian writing about economics, I can do so enthusiastically and with passion. I mean, I have my critiques, but I can affirm markets and all of that. But I really have in mind a Smithian kind of small business commercial world. And when we move up to corporate structures, which clearly have huge gains in terms of efficiency, I myself am a slave to Amazon. So, mea culpa. But it becomes a lot harder for me to affirm the goodness of that structure. I don't really have a good way of thinking about it, but I really want to hear what Russ says about it.
A lot of pressure there, Mary. But I've been thinking a lot about this recently. I'm like you, I'm a huge advocate for trade. I too am an Amazon junkie. I was thinking about, in the earlier question, the discussion about who we respect and the role of wealth in our culture. I don't think anybody really thinks greed is good. I think that's a parody of capitalism, and say Adam Smith for sure, who didn't like greed. But another way to think about that is, do we worship the successful, financially successful people? And people like Jeff Bezos, I think, used to be admired more than they are now. Right now, I think people are very uncomfortable with financially successful people. But there's a romance about them, about people like Elon Musk and others. I'm actually pretty grateful to Jeff Bezos, at least so far. I mean, I'm going to keep the book open, but the number of books that I have, the other stuff that comes to my door, from his genius and the work of the team that he's coordinated, it's an amazing, extraordinary thing. And I think so far, most of it's overwhelmingly for the good. I do think there is an issue though about community. And I think it's a very complicated question. I just interviewed Lamorna Ash about her book, Deep Salt Clear, which is about her time spent in a small fishing village in the southwest corner of England, and how precious that community is, the connections that are made there. And that industry is struggling in its current form because of economies of scale and natural incentives that have pushed them into economic challenges. And that's happening all over the world, right? Places that people used to find work at. In America, it's been happening for 100 years. The transformation from, literally about 100 years, the transformation from an agricultural society with very close family ties, very close community ties, beautiful connections between people. We moved to a more disconnected world, a more urban world. And there are many wonderful things about it. I always think about George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life. Small town life is romanticized there in a beautiful way. Most of us don't want to live in that town. We want to, after, we've seen Paris, we don't want to go back to the farm. We don't want to go back to the small cities. I think there's a tension there in economics and in our choices we make. We talk a lot on Econ Talk about this pull of community and home. I think I want to mention Chris Ornati's book, Dignity, which is about people in desolate economic and financial environments terrible, terrible economic hardship, but they're happy because they're relatively happy. They don't want to go elsewhere. They want to be close to where they grew up. They want to be where their family still is. They want to be with their friends from their youth. And for a lot of us, that's alien. It doesn't speak to us. We've moved 50 times. We've gone to where we thought the opportunities were the greatest, and we've lost those connections. And most of us don't miss them. That's why we made the choice that we made. Or if we miss them, we think the compensations are great enough. But I think there is an issue, and that's part of what I think the unease in Europe and in England and the United States, the populist urge is that, I don't like the people, a lot of people say, I don't like economic change. I don't care whether it makes us richer. I care more about these personal connections that I feel the people feel are being lost. And it comes back to Vernon's point. If our daily economic lives don't yield, and your point, Mary, about the small business commercial world, which is deeply satisfying because it's a cooperative venture. If it isn't that, and it's more decentralized individual people working, remotely, say, it's just a different experience, and there's different trade-offs there to be made among what we value and what we are missing when things change. So I think it's going to be a central question of the next 25 years in public policy. And there's a deeper underlying question, which is, where do we get our sense of community from if we don't have religion, which many people don't, it doesn't speak to them anymore. If we don't have home, people are growing up much more disconnected from their families. If we're living in urban environments where life is more atomized, where do we get our meaning from? And I think that's not an easy question to answer. I think it's a huge question. And again, I don't think we want to decree that from the top down, but we want to give people the opportunity to find it if we can, as they choose to find that meaning for themselves. And I think right now maybe it's a little harder than it used to be.
I thought I would ask you, Russ and Mary and Vern, are there any economists that you would note that we ought to read that would connect us to those issues? We could cite a lot that would connect us to sort of the difficulties and some of the consequences, but are there any economists you would suggest reading that would at least be thinking about the way you expressed this, Russ, so eloquently, about the loss of community, also the disattachment from oneself, the sense of soul, the sense of a quest, the sense of both betterment of oneself and betterment of one's community? What economists would we want to turn to, aside from Mary? Since we definitely want to encourage everyone to read Mary's book.
And yeah, I'd read Mary and Vernon. It's a short list because by definition, I think economists have put themselves into a methodological box that doesn't allow us often, if at all, to talk about those deeper questions. How do you put community into the utility function? Again, going back to Gary Becker, he tried to put family relations into a maximizing framework, did it quite artfully. Most people can't do that artfully, and they just don't try. But I think the tragedy, I would say, of our profession and of modern discourse is that the only voice of those that deal with those challenges come from the left, which is an anti-commercial, anti-capitalist voice. I think we desperately need the de Tocquevilles and others who understood that civil society, the connections we make voluntarily outside of government and outside of profit-making organizations, the voluntary associations we make are often where we get much of our meaning from, and we want to remember that those are central. So I would think about, I don't know who they are, but people who write about that and talk about what it takes to create those connections that are voluntary from the bottom up, that are not profit oriented. So we're not talking about entrepreneurship in the business world, but in the philanthropic or charitable world. And read a lot of dead economists. They were really good on it. James Buchanan, Adam Smith. Read The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Definitely read The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It seems to me that the people at the American Enterprise Institute have a cluster of people who are working on these issues to try to think about our economic problems, especially poverty and inequality, in light of these greater social goods. So I don't want to go out on a limb and name names because I'm going to screw it up, but there is a body of empirical work coming up that's trying to attend to this. One of my steady calls is that we need to get more interdisciplinary among the social sciences if we're going to tackle these problems and try to have some way of communicating about that. Leaving aside what I think is really important to bring more philosophy and theology into these conversations, but just the fact that the disciplines are siloed makes it harder to get a proper account of how to weigh these very different kinds of goods. And I do get the feeling that there's some more movement in the direction of trying to break down those barriers a little bit. So I'm a little bit hopeful about the future, a little hopeful about the future.
It's a question that I might like to pose to someone like Ed Glazer or others who I think has an interest in this kind of level while still working within the kind of maximizing framework. Certainly the triumph of the city is both the death of community and the potential for rethinking how it might occur. So I think we have 1 minute left. So maybe any last closing comments?
Well, I want to emphasize that, you see, our wealth creating capacity of modern markets means that we are freer to choose. We now can choose. We can. It's cheap. It doesn't cost as much to choose a life of meaning. You see, and this is more broadly actually available, and this is what we should be emphasizing. And that's why you see the wisdom of the theory of moral sentiments is so relevant to our times. And here it is, 260 years later. You see that book was written. That's absolutely amazing that a book, you see, would be as so relevant to our today's world as it just as relevant as it was, you see, in 1759 when it was first published.
Well, I thank my panelists. This for me has been a dream come true to have the three of you in front of me conversing. And I hope at some point, just to end on that note, that I hope we can do this in person at some point in a future CORES conference along with a few other friends. Thank you very much for your very positive message to us today. And I'm happy to have you here, and we're closed now. Barry, are there last announcements, or do we just get shut off?
Well, let me say, first of all, that this has been a fantastic conversation. And I add my appreciation, and I'm sure the appreciation of our audience, to our three panelists that have given us so much to think about, to reflect on, to take to heart, to read, all of those things. To those of you in the audience, thank you so much for attending and listening, and for the terrific questions you asked. Let me remind you that if you're interested in programming like this and would like to support it, please visit the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict website, and there's the opportunity to donate to the CORES effort there. For those of you who are interested, we've got a full lineup left today. In just a little bit, at 10:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, we have a panel discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion in science and technology. Elaine Howard-Eklund will be presenting her findings from the most comprehensive international study of scientist attitudes about religion, gender, and ethics ever undertaken. And then she'll be engaged with a number of people who want to put legs to the findings of that study and make a significant impact on inclusion. We have lunch and learn presentations that are terrific for you to listen to a more extended discussion by individual speakers. This afternoon, we have a terrific session on what does God actually do, as well as technology, theology, and a post-secular world. So please take a chance to look at all of those, and thank you so much for attending.